As said, our job at the Joint Research Center is to be the interface between science and policy. We are the ones who should translate scientific results into something that then the policy-making community can use. And my job has been over the past 20 years to try to translate soil-related scientific evidence into something that can be used for the soil-related policy-making process. And that's why I will try in this presentation to give you few highlights of this work, and particularly to tell you what we plan to do in the future and if there is a future at all about soil protection policy in Europe for us. So, first of all, the big issue always in any presentation about soil protection in Europe is that there is still a very large part of the European policymakers who is convinced that there is no problem with soil. Actually, they say, soil, not a relevant topic, there is no problem, we are perfectly fine in our countries with soil, we are doing very well, there is no issue at all. Well, some issues are there that sometimes get evident with some of these pictures. In Europe, sometimes you have some dust storms or you have some events that then suddenly hit the news, and then suddenly maybe somebody is waking up that there is an issue about soils. And so this constant lack of awareness is probably one of the main areas where we could improve a lot if we want to have better soil protection policy in Europe. So trying to explain better why soils need to be protected. Anna just tried in her opening speech to tell you a little bit of the importance. Soils are important, and there is a problem in Europe about soils, but it's not easy to explain it to non-experts and explain it to the citizens outside specialized rooms like this one. So in order to understand what is the perception of the European citizen about soil and the need for soil protection, when we started thinking about protecting soils at EU level through appropriate legislative instruments, the very first thing that we did was to launch a public consultation over the internet to gather any type of opinions from European citizens about what should be done about soils. This was done before we presented our soil thematic strategy. Actually, it was done in 2005. And what was coming out of that public consultation is, first of all, not so many people reacted, let's put it this way. Of course, usually to this type of open consultations, only the people who are aware of soils and are already active in the field will take the time to respond. But nevertheless, it gave us an overview of what were considered most relevant issues. And obviously, typically, for example, soil contamination is ranking immediately very high because this is something that immediately people perceive as a problem, because soil contamination is affecting our health and is affecting our food chain, as potentially is affecting our lives. And that's why there is a lot of awareness about this. So contamination, not only by local contamination by contaminated sites, but also diffuse contamination by pesticides and other chemicals is immediately perceived as a problem. But also other problems were listed, and in general there was a message coming out of such consultation that we should do something about it, and indeed we have been trying to do something in the Commission. As you know, the Commission has the right to propose EU-wide legislation through the treaties that we have. And so we proposed in September 2006 a strategy that was called the EU Thematic Strategy for Soil Protection, that was adopted by the Commission in 22nd of September 2006. The strategy is made up of several documents that you can read if you are interested. Actually, they are available in all EU languages at the websites that you see there, and they consist essentially in 3 documents. There's a communication by the Commission highlighting the strategy, so explaining what we want to do and how we want to achieve it. A second document that is the proposed legislation. It's a proposed soil framework directive. I would say also something more about that. And third document is probably the most interesting one, because this is the necessary impact assessment that should go with each legislative proposal. So every legislation in Europe has to have an impact assessment that is describing what is the benefit to have such legislation and what is the cost of non-action. So what would happen if we don't have any activity at EU level on soils? So still these documents are online, and if you're interested, please have a look. They are, I think, still quite interesting. Now, a few words about the soil thematic strategy and our ideas at that time, how we wanted to go forward. Essentially, there were 4 main pillars of action, main activity areas that we have thought about in order to achieve soil protection in Europe. At the basis, there was the idea to have a framework legislation, a EU Soil Framework Directive. This legislative act would create a framework for national legislations and for action at national level in order to reverse soil degradation processes. Then there was integration into other policies. This means integrating systematically soil protection into other policy areas which are soil relevant. For example, the Common Agricultural Policy is probably one of the best known policies in Europe. It's taking nearly 40% of the total budget of the EU, so it's a quite relevant policy. So putting their soil protection criteria in the Common Agricultural Policy was something that we were very keen of. Actually, we succeeded to have, as you know, in the cross-compliance schemes or in the schemes that are obligatory for farmers, in order to get subsidies, you must now also include in your activities proper soil management practices. Otherwise, you cannot get the direct payments. So this is just an example, but there are other policy areas. The climate change policy now is very much into, they are very much caring about soil organic carbon. There is, for example, the energy policy, where we have a lot of interest now and a lot of elements into the Renewable Energy Directive addressing production of bioenergy crops on degraded soils, all kind of integration into other policy areas. Thirdly, very important research, probably interesting to you. We thought that there's not enough known about soils, that there's still a lot of research activity that is needed in order to understand better how soil functions. Particularly some of the areas we identified as being little known are, for example, all the soil ecologies or all these soil biodiversity. A lot of biota is not well described. We don't know very well what is below ground and how it functions. So more money was put in the Framework Program 7, and I will come back also to that on our perspectives for the next framework, or for the current framework program, which is called Horizon 2020. So more money was put into the EU budget for research concerning soils, and there were several project finance, pretty big ones, and we are looking forward to the results of this project to then decide what next. Finally, and I mentioned it already, we saw that the 4th pillar of our action, very important one, is awareness raising. It's written small there, but I think it's the most important one. As I said, if we are not able to explain to non-experts why we should be caring for soils and why we should protect soils and why we should have sustainable soil management, it's very difficult and very unlikely that we will succeed to get a true action on the ground concerning soil protection in Europe. So awareness raising is very important. I will come back also to that during my presentation. So already Anna presented to you a basic concept of our soil strategy, that was that we identified 7 functions that we want to protect. Let me explain also why we focus on functions and not on soils. You should be aware that soils in Europe are for the large majority in private property. So soils are owned by somebody, and legislating about private property is always a pretty complex issue from a legislative point of view, from a legal point of view. And that's why we focus on legislating about functions. These 7 functions are not private property. These 7 functions are delivering services to all of us. The first function, biomass production, delivering food and biomass, is something relevant to all of us. It was already mentioned that we are going towards a world with more people, and we need all to eat and to have some clothes, and that's why this function is serving all of us. Of course, soils are in private property, but private owners have to take care of this function because it's important. As well as all the others, storing, filtering water is obviously a function that allows us to have clean drinking water here on the table. It's because there is some soils being filtering this water, and that's, again, a function delivering a public service. It may be a private soil, but it's a public function. And so the same for all the others, physical and cultural environment, a source of raw materials, carbon pool. It was already mentioned in a previous introductory presentation, and I don't need to come back to this. But it's important to understand why we focus on that. It was because we need to explain the public goods that are delivered by soils. So something that needs to be cared for all of us, independently if it's in private or in public property. Now, these functions are under threat. This is another key message. As I said in the beginning, it looks to all of us obvious, especially if you're a soil specialist, you would say it's an obvious statement that there are processes degrading soil functions, erosion, contamination, soil sealing, all the things that you see mentioned on this slide. But don't think that this is obvious to everybody. Most people outside this room will say there is no problem, and they will say all this is not happening because it's not visible. You see, it's very difficult to get the impression that there is a problem if you are not affected. There is now increased awareness in some EU member states for some of these processes. If I talk about my own country, I'm coming from Italy. In Italy now there is a very big awareness about the issue of soil sealing. Italy is a densely populated country, and we have a very high sealing rate, very high consumption of soil by infrastructure and housing. And slowly the national authorities are getting aware that this can be potentially a very big problem for the country. And so we will have probably, and we have right now in the Italian parliament, a legislation in discussion about limiting soil sealing, because it's something that people perceive as a problem. But many of the other problems are very difficult to be perceived. I mean, if we talk about loss of organic carbon, yes, it's a problem, but not affecting me personally, even though it's affecting me because it's changing the climate, but difficult to explain. So as I said, these problems need to be explained, they need to be documented, and I don't go through all the huge amount of work that has been done over the past 20 years to document, and it was already mentioned, the various reports from the European Environment Agency or from the JRC about the state of European soils that describe to which extent these problems are present and are affecting the European Union. As I said, soil organic carbon is usually ranking very high in all discussions in policy-making circles. This is because this issue has now entered this debate on climate change. And as I said, this is a big carbon pool. In Europe, we estimate around, in the first 30 centimeters, around 70 gigatons of CO2 equivalent into the first 30 centimeters, which is something interesting for negotiators, because if you change management of these soils, you may emit more in the atmosphere or store more in the soils. So there has been quite some work going on soil organic matter and understanding better the distribution of soil organic carbon, combining new data, for example, coming also from forestry. Since this is a forestry meeting, we had a big survey in 2006 called Biosoil, which was repeating the sampling on the 16 by 16 kilometer grid originally developed by ICP Forest. So we have quite a wealth of new data from point sampling exercises that can allow us to better estimate the distribution of soil organic carbon. Another issue that is always coming up in any discussion is the issue of soil erosion. Usually, policymakers like to have a map like the ones you see here on your left side, a sort of traffic-like map, maximum 3 colors, green, yellow, and red. In green, it means below 2 tons per hectare per year. In yellow, it means between 2 and 10 tons per hectare per year. And in red is above 10 tons per hectare a year. And you may say, why these numbers? Well, OECD has decided that erosion above 10 tons per hectare per year, actually 11 tons per hectare per year, is considered as a problem. Anything below that is considered not a problem, a natural process. So we have a threshold above which countries have to do something because it's considered not anymore sustainable. By the way, what you see on this left side is water erosion, but there's an increasing interest in Europe also to have information about wind erosion. It's the map you see on the right-hand side, which is still ongoing work we are doing with some new modeling of wind erosion fraction of the soil, which is estimated to be erodable by wind erosion, so that we can target the areas which are more at risk and then, of course, take measures. Linked to erosion and often confused with erosion, there is the issue of landslides. Landslides are mass movements of soils and are a serious problem in many parts of Europe. By the way, landslides are very much linked to what you do with the soil. Forestry has always been one of the topics linked with landslides. It's claimed that chopping down forests may help having landslides more frequently. And there's been a claim that in the areas which are in red, we should have more forests in order to protect these soils from being prone to landslides. It's a highly debated topic and a very sensitive one, because obviously this is typically one of the threats where people are affected. Their property is being affected, sometimes even their life that have been lost for this erosion, for this landslide event. So there's a lot of attention to this issue. My country, by the way, Italy, as you can see, it's pretty red. It's one of the most affected countries in Europe by landslides. And so in Italy particularly, there's a lot of attention to this topic, which is every year hitting the news with some disasters. Now, as I already mentioned, probably the topic that has been gaining most of the attention in the last couple of years has been the issue of urbanization and of the constant growth of the coverage of soils by infrastructure and housing. If you recall my slide on the functions, covering the soil with housing and infrastructure is a function, it's not a threat. Actually, somewhere we must live, so actually we need to have some space, and the space is given us by soil. So where starts to be soil sealing a threat and not a function? Well, this is a big debate that is ongoing now. As I said, in some countries, this is even hitting the political agenda. Definitely the big issue is that in Europe, soil sealing is essentially decoupled from population growth. We have in Europe essentially a flat population growth rate, but at the same time, we have a steep curve of soil sealing being increasing over the past years. So obviously, it's not due to the fact that we have more people in Europe. It's simply due to the fact that we have more economic growth. Luckily, this is generating growth in jobs and in economic development. So it's a quite hot topic because, you know, we are in Europe right now in a pretty serious economic crisis. And one of the things that many governments advocate is to have more building activities, more housing, more infrastructure, more of these activities that generate jobs and generates economic growth. So it's a hot debate, and it's a very interesting debate about sustainability. If we look to the data, and it was already mentioned, we had several assessments done recently. Obviously, there are some champions in Europe about soil sealing. One of the biggest champions you see on the left-hand side map, it's the areas in red. These are the countries who are the champions in increasing soil sealing. Spain is a particularly known case, as well as Portugal and Ireland. By the way, it matches a little bit the countries who went through a pretty serious crisis in the past years due to the enormous growth of housing and infrastructure construction activities that were much overshooting the actual capacity of the country to finance it. And so it's an interesting data set that tells you the growth of land take from 2000 to 2006. Obviously, if you then look to the other map, this is not a serious problem for a country like Spain in absolute terms, because of course it's a country which has relatively low density of population. So in absolute terms, the soil sealed surface in 2006 is mostly concentrated in the concentration areas of the Netherlands, Belgium, some parts of UK, and other smaller areas. So in absolute terms, this is obviously not very impressive, but in relative terms and in growth rates, if you look to the growth 2000-2006, it's quite impressive. Extreme cases, by the way, are our two island member states, Cyprus and Malta, which has exactly the opposite trend. Cyprus has a very rapid growth, but very low absolute coverage of the country. Malta is exactly the opposite. Malta is saturated with construction, so it's totally red in the right-hand side, but the rate is practically zero because there is no space anymore to build anything. So it's the two extremes, and maybe it's giving you an impression of where we should go or where we should not go. So, a very hot topic, and if you are interested in this, there have been extensive work of the Commission on this hot topic. There is in all languages of the EU our communication on what should be done, but as well you may find also in Spanish and in other main languages the guidelines for reducing this that we have released a couple of years ago. Now, let me go now to our legislation and our policy-making process, because this is our job. The Commission is there to do this. And we have introduced, as I said, the soil issue in many policy frameworks. Recently, we have had a shift, you may know, in the EU from environmental protection towards resource efficiency. Environmental protection is not fashionable anymore since some years because it's not generating jobs and economic growth. So we talk now more when we say environmental protection, we talk about resource efficiency, and we released in 2011 an important document for us because it's the roadmap that we want to apply for resource efficiency in Europe. And in this roadmap that you can read, all available freely on all languages, you will find that by 2020 we have some serious targets. We would like to reduce land take and actually achieve by 2050 no net land take, which means by 2050 stopping completely consumption of soils by housing and infrastructure. Soil erosion should be reduced, soil organic matter increased, and of course we should do something about contaminated sites. All this should be then spelled out in how we want to do it in a communication that we are just preparing now. It's the new communication on land use. You may have heard about it. We had a meeting in Brussels in June discussing this with stakeholders and member states. It will be spelling out what we want to do about land use in the next years in the European Union. So all this is fitting within an action plan, which you know is the European Union Environment Action Programme that was presented also in 2011, which is titled Living Well Within the Limits of Our Planet. Very nice sounding title, where again you will find what we want to do in the next years, particularly the issue of soil is not neglected. We still want to do something about soil and land. And so if you're interested, please go to that document that is saying exactly what we will do in the next years. Now, the main news that, of course, have been hitting the news for all of us this year has been that this commission, the Commission Barroso, before leaving office, has decided to withdraw a number of legislative proposals. It's the famous REFIT communication. This is a communication by the Commission that was essentially responding to the demand by the Parliament and by member states to reduce what is called red tape. So reducing EU legislation in order to reduce the administrative burden for member states, and a complete package of legislative proposals that were in the pipeline and were a little bit stuck were put into this REFIT communication and were withdrawn by the Commission. One of the proposals that we withdrew was the Soil Framework Directive, that was retracted by the Commission with the argumentation, which I think is very reasonable, that after 8 years, if we have not succeeded to convince the 5 member states who have been opposing to have soil protection in Europe, we all know which ones they are, against a majority of member states who wanted to protect soils, apparently there is no way to make progress, and so we have decided after 8 years to withdraw this proposal. Nevertheless, we have added a little corrigendum to the decision at the last moment that we remain committed as Commission to protect soils and to examine options on how to best achieve this as soon as we will have a new Commission. So we will ask our new Commission, once they are in office, starting 1st of November, what they want to do about soils and land, and maybe they want to do something, maybe not. I cannot predict it. So as I said, this is our current situation. But of course, we are still working, and as I said, we have some plans which are approved, which is essentially the resource efficiency roadmap, and as I said, the communication as land as a resource. There is now a very active working group of member states helping us in drafting this communication, which will contain what we want to do on land in the near future in Europe, based essentially on a number of reports and of data that we have been collecting over the past years, particularly through our Luca survey or other surveys that we do. We had a land conference in 19th of June where we have discussed this with stakeholders and member states, and we will launch now a public consultation, as we did for the soil directive, to hear what the citizens would like us to do about land. And of course, we hope in 2015 to adopt this communication so that we have some progress also from our side. Finally, let me say that all this is fitting within a new vision that has been emerging at the Rio +20 meeting, which for the Commission has been a very important event, even though in the news it was downgraded as a little bit unconclusive. For us, there were several elements in the Rio +20 negotiations. Just to explain, the Rio conference of 92 was the famous sustainability conference where it was decided to have, for example, the Climate Change Convention, the Desertification Convention, the Biodiversity Convention. So it was the big sustainable development conference. 20 years after, there was again a meeting in Rio to see where we are with our Millennium Development Goals and where should we go in the future. And actually where we should go in the future has been spelled out then in a document approved by all countries in the world that is called The Future We Want. And in that document, we were very proud to have finally approved by all countries a vision towards a zero net land degradation world, which means to go in the future towards, in global level, to have zero land degradation, because land is a limited resource and we all need it. So our work will fit very much into this overarching global goal, and we are now very much active into looking how we should achieve this, because it's a balance between land degradation and land restoration to get zero net land degradation. So it means, of course, we cannot stop completely land degradation in the world, but we can compensate land degradation with land restoration, and maybe at the end we have a land degradation neutral world. So a lot of effort is now going on from our side into particularly land restoration. This because we think we know a lot about land degradation, but we are not doing very much on land restoration, and we should do much more. Land restoration is very important now because it's generating jobs, it's generating economic growth, and it's positively contributing to the goal that we have set in this document. So we will certainly do a lot in the near future on land restoration. Actually, we are now looking around for case studies to finance. Particularly, we are looking into launching a very large European program within Horizon 2020 to have a network of demonstration sites where we show positive effects of land restoration, soil restoration. I just was visiting a couple of weeks ago in Galicia this site, which I was very impressed of, a mining site that has been restored in Galicia, which I found very impressive, but there are also others. And so we are trying now to establish a network of this and show that you can do positive things about soil restoration and land restoration, and that we can revert the negative trend with practical activities. So as I said, this is the work ahead. Now, of course, we are very much into this post-2015 negotiation. As I said, we are negotiating at global level the famous new sustainable development goals that will replace the Millennium Development Goals. We are insisting that one of the goals that we should achieve in the future is to protect soils and land. We think that soil and land are important for sustainable development. Some people say no, but I think it is. Without soil and land, I don't see how you can live in a sustainable way on this planet. So we are introducing in several targets now soil and land related wording, if I can call it like this, which of course is helping us a lot then in the EU level activities. This is the road that we have of the negotiation. The final adoption of these sustainable development goals will be in the global summit that will be in September 2015. And this is for us very nice because this is matching, of course, the 2015 International Year of Soils that was already mentioned at the end of the presentation of Anna, which is for us a very important event because it was quite an interesting negotiation to get this international year approved in the UN General Assembly. You may be surprised, but there were several countries strongly opposing to have an international year of soils. So having achieved this and having now a year where we will dedicate all our efforts towards protecting soils will be a very important success. And I hope we will also do things in Spain and in the Basque Country as in all the world. So you're very welcome to come up with proposals and ideas. Thank you very much for your attention. You want questions? I'm more than happy to reply.
Okay, maybe we have some questions for Luca. If you want. a couple of questions. We have some time. So maybe I have one question for you, Luca.
Please.
What would be your connection with forest world?
Yeah, the forest world is a separate world. So, but I appreciate the effort, and that's why I'm interested in meetings like this, where you try to bring these worlds together. One of the biggest difficulties that we have, not only in Europe, is that we still work very much into sort of silos. Foresters talk to foresters, soil scientists talk to soil scientists, agronomists talk to agronomists, and I don't believe this is very realistic. As I was saying, when we talk about land, land is including forest, is including soil, is including water, is including many things. So I think we should have more interactions of this kind. I think it's a very good initiative to have this. We don't have so much interaction anymore since we don't have, as you know, any more EU regulation on forestry. So forestry is out of the radar of EU policy. So it's not anymore an area where we are active. We stopped essentially with our forest soil monitoring activities that, you know, we were managing first within ICP Forest and then as a commission activity. Honestly, for the moment, the interaction is rather low, if I can put it this way. But maybe we can use this meeting to find a way to improve the situation. I'm very happy to help if I can.